At the India Today Conclave, we're now going to look at New India. Mirror, mirror, what does the Modi mandate of 2019 really tell us about New India? I'm joined by two very fine speakers, both now politicians. Both came from the same college, St. Stephen's. Shashi Tharoor came from my school, so he gets the advantage here in Mumbai. One is to my left, the other is to my extreme left. That has nothing to do with their politics. One is firmly in the right corner. One is, and Shashi Tharoor claims he's in the center where he belongs. Fair enough. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Swapan Dasgupta, give them a very big hand. One from the Congress, one from the BJP. Let's decode the new India with Dr. Tharoor and Swapan Dasgupta. So I'm going to start by asking both of you a very simple question. What is the one thing, Dr. Tharoor, you like about Modi's New India? What's the best thing about Modi's New India?
Do you mean the formulation? Because in his famous speech on Independence Day when he described New India, I mean, it was difficult to disagree with the idea of New India that he talked about. So if that's the question, in other words, is it the New India that he's projected, one that will be free of casteism, communalism, progressive, inclusive, etc., I'm fully in agreement with the concept. If you're asking me about the reality of New India, of specific projects Mr. Modi has undertaken, I find much less to admire. I suppose the one example which in any case is well known is probably Swachh Bharat. Some aspects of it. I still think that the reality of India is not much more Swachh than it was before he started, but he has put Swachh Bharat on the top of the national agenda. He has built toilets. Many of those toilets don't have drinking water, so that's a problem many of us have. But broadly speaking, that's an example of an initiative which took a certain amount of, shall we say, original thinking, not that sanitation programs didn't exist before, but to take it up to the prime ministerial level and put it before the nation as an objective that had to be fulfilled. That, I think, has been impressive, though a lot of progress still needs to be made.
The reason I asked you this is because you stirred it up by suggesting a few weeks ago that the time has come not to demonize Narendra Modi.
That was actually Jairam Ramesh's phrase. I said, I agree that our criticism will have much more credibility if we're willing to praise the things that when he says or does the right thing.
So the only thing that you find praiseworthy in the last 5.5 years is toilet building.
Look, I have in the past also praised, for example, the soft power advantages of getting the International Day of Yoga declared. That was a Modi initiative which I welcomed at the time and continue to applaud, because I think it's important for us to showcase aspects of our culture that we like. I thought you would only ask for one example, but that's another one. I thought some of the early initiatives in the first couple of years of his first term, for example, to host a World Buddhist Conference, to host a World Sufi Conference, some of those things were very interesting. It was India seemingly trying to depict itself as we had in the past argued we should be, as a kind of showcase to the world of pluralism, diversity, inclusiveness. But the government has moved away from that, unfortunately, to a much more Hindutva sort of approach thereafter.
We'll come to the Hindutva approach in a moment, but Swapan Dasgupta, what's the one thing that you dislike about Modi's New India?
Well, I could try and prevaricate and circumvent the world like Shashi did and be sort of squeamish about showering any form of praise on the Prime Minister. But if I was to say, what do I dislike about Modi's India? I dislike the fact that a very large section of extremely articulate Indians, well-heeled, sometimes called the intellectuals, sometimes the intelligentsia, go all over the world and rubbish this country. And rubbish this country with a vehemence with which it hasn't been seen before. And that's what I really dislike about Modi's India, that this is a true state of affairs.
At least I tried to answer your question the way you wanted me to. I must say, Chopin wrote a very good op-ed just about a week or 10 days ago in one of the newspapers he writes for, saying that he was quite concerned that a large number of Muslims in this country are alienated, that they're feeling fearful, that they're feeling insecure in their status in this country. I think that would have been a more honest answer because you've said it in public already, Swapan.
He wants to answer for you, Dr. Dasgupta.
I've read him.
He believes he basically believes you're prevaricating by, I mean, let's be honest, you did write that article suggesting that there is a sense of
I'm so glad that that article got such a lot of
concern among Muslims and minorities in Modi's new India.
May I just suggest something?
Yes.
What I was articulating in that article was that a sense of ghettoization appears to have happened. And that ghettoization, the reasons for that ghettoization are quite complex. I don't blame one side for it. I blame a series of issues. But that ghettoization is not a desirable state of being. That conversations need to happen, and some of these conversations are not taking place. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable point of view, and I think that's a point of view which the Prime Minister agrees. And I think there's absolutely nothing to suggest that that is in any way contrary to the very bright and entirely positive India which is growing out of Modi.
Okay, you say there's a lack of conversation between communities. People will say it's much more than that. There is a sense of enmity, hostility today between communities. Communities get demonized. But Shashi Tharoor, define your vision then of what Hindutva is all about. You've written about it. What is your definition of Hindutva? Why for you is Hindutva a word that troubles you and liberals like you so much?
Because it goes fundamentally against what the freedom struggle was all about. Our freedom struggle divided, as you know, not on ideological grounds, a Marxist versus capitalist, or liberals versus socialists. It divided on the basic question of whether religion should be the determinant of nationhood. One set of people said it should be. That was the idea of Pakistan, and they created a country based on the idea that their nationhood was going to emerge from religion. But the other set of people, Mahatma Gandhi, Nehruji, Maulana Azad, Ambedkar, Rajendra Prasad, you name them all, the whole bunch of these nationalist leaders said, no, our freedom struggle has been for everybody. We have one freedom for everyone, and we will write a constitution and create a country that includes everyone and that gives everyone equal rights. That's the fundamental premise of what India has been all about, and that is the constitution that Prime Minister Modi and his ministers are sworn to uphold and defend. But if you look at the Hindutva doctrine going right back to Savarkar's foundational text of 1925 and looking at the various other books that have come out of the likes of Golwalkar and Deen Dayal Upadhyay, they fundamentally reject this idea of India. They reject the constitution of India. They explicitly state that India should be a Hindu Rashtra. And there is this entire theoretical construct in Hindutva that says the biggest flaw of modern India is its notion of territorial nationalism. That India and Indian democracy and the Indian constitution assumes that India is a territory called India and the constitution is for all the people on it. Wrong, they say. A nation is not a territory, a nation is a people, and the people of India are only the Hindu people. That is why they speak of a Hindu Rashtra. I'm summarizing their beliefs, but I believe with some degree of accuracy, this is what Hindutva stands for. And to my mind, it's fundamentally unacceptable because that's not the India that I have sworn allegiance to, that I have returned to, that I've grown up in, and that I've read, studied, and cherished.
What if I told you that Shashi Tharoor is alienated in that sense? Is a marginal voice to the new India. Here you've had Mr. Modi and the BJP win a big majority in 2019, and the liberal project that you speak about today is discredited. That Shashi Tharoor's Nehruvian India has been replaced by Modi's India. Will you agree with that?
No, because I think the Constitution, according to the Prime Minister, is his holy book. Then he ought to live up to it.
You don't accept that the liberal project, the Nehruvian India project, has been discredited or is no longer acceptable to a large majority of Indians?
No, that I don't agree because Mr. Modi, Mr. Modi and the BJP won 37% of the vote in the last elections. So an overwhelming majority of Indians have still not bought into Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan. That is not, at the moment, yet the majority view.
Swapan Dasgupta, respond to that. According to Shashi Tharoor, the Constitution of India is the holy book. In the BJP's majoritarian worldview, the Constitution is not the holy book. The BJP wants a Hindu Rashtra. Modi's India is actually about a Hindu Rashtra.
Well, first, let me compliment Shashi for believing that he actually won the election. believing that the BJP did not get a mandate. That's the first thing. It's the sense of denial which often characterizes people like him. I have no intention of going into the etymological origins of
That was the
Hindutva,
question.
Of etymological origins of Hindutva, of what Savarkar said and what Golwalkar said. We can go into that. That's an abstruse academic debate. The basic point is very simple, that there is something called the Constitution of India. What does the Constitution of India say? The Constitution of India defines the rules on which public life is and should be conducted in India. It's very clearly a rule book. There is something called the Indian nation, which goes far beyond the Constitution. The Indian nation was not created in 1950. There existed a nation which is before that. And that nation has been defined not so much in territorial terms, although that is also a part of it, but it has been in civilizational terms. And one of the features of that civilization, the cultural features of civilization, can be broadly said that the large underpinnings of it can loosely be called Hindu. It does not mean Hindu in a religious, in a ritualistic sense. It means Hindu in a very loose cultural sense. And one of the features which defined the India which grew up after 1950, which wasn't there prior to 1950, was the sheer defensiveness and the fact that to say Hindu had become a cuss word. And that pejorative connotation has been taken out of that. We have to recognize that the cultural dimensions of what is India is largely defined by that Hindu. This is not to say there are not other features of that. There are many other features of it. Some of them are secular, some of them are religious, some of them may be other forms, technological, etc. But to deny that, to my mind, is to try and say that India is a rootless civilization, that India is defined only by a codification of laws. To my mind, that is not the case. There is much more of a meaning behind that, which is why Shashi spends so much of his time writing books on what it means to be a Hindu. I don't need to define what it means to be a Hindu. I don't want to codify what it means to be a Hindu. I think it's there. I don't have to define my Hinduness, and I don't want my Hinduness to come into someone else's Hinduness.
No, so are you saying Hindutva is to be defined in this new
No,
India
it should not.
purely in cultural terms?
Is
it in cultural terms or is it in political terms? At the end of the day, it's wonderful to have this debate about the cultural aspects of Hinduism.
I'm not debating. I actually agree with him on culture.
But I'm glad you agree with it, because
it's the political doctrine of Hindutva that we're talking about.
No, so what is the political doctrine?
What I described in
No. For example, let's talk about Ram Mandir, an issue which has now come up and which has now come up in the Supreme Court in its final stage, may well be settled by the middle of November. Do you believe, Shashi Tharoor, for example, that a Ram Mandir, in your view, is, as is suggested by the likes of Dr. Dasgupta and Subramaniam Swamy, is a matter of faith?
Well, not in the same breath, please.
Okay, not in the same breath. I was just provoking you by linking you to Dr. Swamy. But in a way, do you believe that it is an article of faith and therefore faith must triumph in the context, let's say, of a Ram Mandir? Or do you see it as the political construct of Hindutva that troubles you?
For once, let me listen to the Prime Minister. He's urged us all to shut up about this issue until after the Supreme Court has pronounced itself, and I think I'm going to leave it there.
That sounds like an extremely defensive response.
I've expressed my views in the past. I've said
What is your view?
No, I don't think that it was right to demolish another person's place of worship. But at the same time, I respect the sentiment of those who want a temple there. Some other accommodation should have been found short of an act of violence and vandalism. And that, I think, is a position that was echoed at the time by even the likes of Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Advani. Mr. Advani said it was the saddest day of his life, the day the masjid was destroyed. So let's leave it there, because at the moment the specific issues at dispute are before the court, and I don't unnecessarily want to stir up a new controversy. What I've said, I said years ago, and that remains on the record. But today we're leaving it to the courts. Let's leave it there.
But do you accept...
But, you've gone off the point. My point is precisely, Chopin has defined Hindutva down in very lovable terms. I love Hindu culture and Indian culture.
Thank you for at least accepting the Hindutva.
No, but that's not Hindutva.
It is Hindutva. You're forcing you to say, no, it is not. That it is actually an ogre.
There is a book called The Essentials of Hindutva by Savarkar. You've got to understand what Hindutva is. It's a political doctrine. Savarkar explicitly says.
As I said, that it is not, the Savarkar does not have a monopoly of anything.
But it's his idea, but it's
the
his
word
theory.
predated Savarkar,
it's like saying Marx,
and it will post-date.
Marx doesn't have a monopoly on Marxism, but it's called Marxism because he started it. Same thing. It's called Hindutva because Savarkar
did not
initiate
the term. There are much earlier. Please read my book.
I will. I will.
It's very,
give me a copy.
We can go about reading each other's books, but this actually goes beyond books to the reality on the ground. How does it play out?
That's my point.
How does it play out in New India? Dare I say, Swapan Dasgupta, every time there is a lynching, for example, in the name of the cow, right? When a group of cow vigilantes say that, resort to violence in the name of the cow, what kind of an India is that? Is that not majoritarianism expressing itself in an ugly form, which is not really what India's civilizational ethos, to use your word?
Yeah, it's a very disagreeable act. It's a completely disagreeable act. It's an ugly act. And I don't think anyone should mince words about saying that it's a completely ugly act and it should not happen. And the people who have done it should be very firmly dealt with.
But
having said that,
why is it then
hang
the
on,
number of lynchings in the name of the cow have increased post-2014?
Is this a discussion or a television show? If it's a television show, let's view it in that way.
No, two of you were fighting, not me.
No. Hang on. The point is very simply this, that in India, something as ugly as lynching is to be condemned unequivocally. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I will also remind you one more thing, that whether we like it or not, and regardless of our own personal food preferences, there exists in India, and that's an undeniable reality, some sort of aversion to beef. And it's a very, very sensitive subject. Whether in your personal lives, everywhere, you must have seen it. And that is something you cannot deny. Secondly, I would also go on to say, when Shashi did not want to venture his comments on Ayodhya, but Shashi, because he comes from Kerala, because he fights elections in Kerala, was not so squeamish when it came to the Sabarimala issue. And there, first having said that the constitution must prevail, secondly said, no, popular sentiment should also be acknowledged, and so popular sentiment should also prevail. And that popular sentiment meant that there were certain customs in vogue in Sabarimala which had to be respected. And I think that's a very enlightened position coming from a constitutionalist who actually recognizes that culture too defines our nation. And that without culture, you cannot have a pure statutory, you cannot have something called constitutional patriotism and manufacture and say that year 1950 was year zero as the Germans made it in their case.
Shashi Tharoor, somewhere are the liberals trapped? New India, in a way, is recognizing, in a sense, its religious identity, not always in opposition to the other, but a sense of pride in culture is how Dr. Dasgupta would put it. And for much too long, the Nehruvians in particular, and I think you see yourself as a proud Nehruvian, denied the existence of that religious identity. And that has come to bite you back now all these years later. The BJP is seen in a way as the party that represents that authentic cultural civilizational identity in a way that the Congress doesn't. Instead, you are portrayed today as a pro-Muslim minority appeasing party, and that's the trap that you are in. They put you in that trap.
Okay, let me just move back a bit. First of all, I do feel you let Chopin off the hook. Since this is not a television show, let me say this. When he said that the lynchings and so on must be unequivocally condemned, how does he justify the prolonged and repeated silence of the Prime Minister on every one of these occasions? Which sends a bad signal, because when you don't condemn, you implicitly condone. And this was the reason why the shadow has fallen over the Muslim community. That every time a Muslim is assaulted in the name of the cow or whatever, there is this resounding silence from the top. But there are ministers who don't lose an opportunity to divide this country into Ramzadeh and ... The minister who says, if you disagree with us, go to Pakistan. I mean, what is the signal of all this? If you are implying that anyone who disagrees with you must be a Muslim or a Muslim lover and therefore belongs in Pakistan, that's a pretty shameful thing to be, for a minister of the realm to actually say to the people of this country. Let me add, of course, that if you really want to send your critics far away, you should suggest Canada and not Pakistan. But they haven't, apparently their imagination doesn't stretch that far. I mean, let me come back to your question about whether liberals are trapped. The fact is that, as I said, mathematically a majority of the country is not yet with Mr. Modi. He's gone up from 31 to 37, great.
You've stayed at 19. You
We
can
stayed
go
at
on
19.
about
I've said
BJP
this
going
was-
on from 31 to 37. You've stayed at 19. That's
Agreed.
half of the BJP.
I agreed, but if you add the Shiv Sena, which is the only other Hindutva-oriented party, you still get to 41, 42% of the country. You don't get to 50. You don't get to 51. Right?
Has any party got 51?
Beg your pardon?
Has any party in any general election since 1952 crossed 50%
No,
of the
I'm not talking
popular
about
vote?
individual party. I'm saying,
No, no.
therefore,
So
parties,
tell me that. No, no, tell
all
me
the
that.
remaining parties which are not subscribers to Hindutva ideology, cumulatively still represent the majority opinion in this country. Undoubtedly, they're divided on other
Was
political
that election fought on the basis of Hindutva? Was this a referendum
became-
like
it
Brexit,
became
which
about-
was fought on the basis of
it became
Hindutva?
on about a few
You
issues.
decide, having said it, that you decide that this is an election which was fought on the basis of Hindutva. On what basis have you come to this conclusion? Was performance not a factor in this election? Was leadership not a factor in this election?
Let me say, as far as performance-
These were the real issues in the election. Maybe in one corner of India there might have been issues of, sectarian identity. But overall, this election was fought on very, very basic issues, which included if I may say
but
so,
let me-
another issue on which you all were silent about, which is about Balakot. It was about terrorism. It was about the right of Indians to actually have a robust foreign policy.
No, listen, okay, let's come to all of that. Do you mind if I just
Yes.
respond? Because these are important issues. Number one, he says, if it wasn't about Hindutva, it was about other things, performance. We felt objectively that if it was going to be about performance, this government would lose. We had the highest unemployment rate in 45 years. We had a level of agricultural distress so extreme that farmers were committing suicide in droves, so high that the government for the first time is suppressing the numbers. We've had exports down, the index of industrial production down, merchandise output down. There was simply nothing going well in the economy. And many of us thought, why would a young man in UP who voted for Mr. Modi 5 years ago in the expectation of getting a job, vote for him again when he still doesn't have a job? Well, we were wrong. And we were wrong because, indeed, Pulwama Balakot was a very good example of how the national security issue was indeed used to support the BJP effort. Because the opposition was in a bind. For us to say, whose fault was it that 40 coffins went back to villages in India? Whose security lapses resulted in these 40 deaths? Would have been seen as somehow unpatriotic. For us to say, did your Balakot bombings actually take out any terrorists, or did you hit a bunch of trees on a deserted hillside as the international media is claiming? Tell us what the proof is. We didn't say it again because we felt we have to stand by the soldiers, we have to stand under the flag, we have to be with the Air Force. And as a result, yes, we deprived ourselves of a legitimate critique of this national security posturing, which the government ran away with in northern India. So there are factors. Mr. Modi's larger-than-life image undoubtedly was a factor. And even though the macroeconomy had failed, the fact that they could point to these toilets and these gas cylinders, even though 65% of the toilets don't have running water, even though 92% of the beneficiaries of the gas cylinders could not afford refills because the government doesn't subsidize them for BPL families sufficiently.
75% actually took refills.
No.
75% took
Come on,
refills.
I've just seen the figures from
75,
government.
that's the figure. It's there on the official
It must be a
website.
new figure that's happened since the election. But at that time it
Those
was 90.
figures are contentious, but let me come to
are
concept.
they?
No, those figures, look.
No, Rajdeep, you say, you're the
One
statistical
minute,
guru.
1 minute. No, I said
But
his-
may I respond to the larger question which Shashi has?
Let's come to larger questions.
The larger
One
question
of those
which he
larger
talked about.
questions comes from what you raised,
No,
which is the definition of nationalism in New India.
I want to
I
also-
want to know from you, both of you, what is your definition of this muscular nationalism that we keep talking about? You start, Dr. Dasgupta, and then let Mr. Tharoor respond.
Well, first I want to point out,
Yes.
it's fine for Shashi to agonize over where they got it wrong. And I think it's a legitimate post-mortem which any political party, whether they win or they lose, must conduct. But I think there's one thing which is missing, and which is a very important part of what constitutes Modi's India, and which is really the point from 2014 and an ongoing process. And what is that? I think from 2014 to now, there is one thing which we can say, is that for the first time since 1947, we have started rolling back the tide of corruption in India. We haven't eliminated it, but each year we can see it's getting less and less and less, and that there are actual incentives and deterrents to being corrupt in India today. And to my mind, something with the political will from the top, that is what defines Modi's India, that you can actually have a far more wholesome public life which is there, which includes not sparing some of the high and mighty. And you made the contest, I'm not going into that.
We can debate
now,
on
having said that,
it seems
to my
almost,
mind,
Dr.
the nationalism,
Dr.
then I'm
Dasgupta,
coming to the nationalism.
Dr. Dasgupta, I can't allow you to get away with a sweeping statement like that to suggest that we are a corruption-free India today.
No, we are not. Did I say that?
No.
Did I say we've started rolling back the tide? There is an English language which is very specific and which had said rolling back.
I should be very careful with the English language with the two of you, but rolling back. Let's be very honest. Whether it's in Bengal, your home state, or Goa, my home state, the kind of people who you've taken into the BJP, the Matka king of Goa, the person in Goa who was accused by your own party 3 months ago of being a rapist, in your own state, Mukul Roy, charged under Sarda scam, questioned under it, moment he joins the BJP, he becomes, all his sins are washed. Come on, Dr. Dasgupta, you know politics better than anyone else.
I think he wasn't charged. I think
no, I said question. No, he wasn't charged, but it's very interesting that all the others who are still in the Trinamool, FIRs are liberally being filed against them. Mr. Roy suddenly seems to emerge as, he's just one example, but as I said, this seems to be happening all the time. 2 TDP MPs. Just a minute. 2 TDP MPs in the Rajya Sabha who were called equivalents of Vijay Mallya are now in your party. Let's not talk about corruption. Let's talk about nationalism for a moment. Give me your definition about nationalism.
I think we should talk about corruption. We should talk about corruption because I think you're completely right in suggesting that there are people who've entered the BJP seeing the sort of opening for their own little good. Whether this is due to any ideological change in the BJP or whether it is due to a desire to actually make the country a little more, the opposition a little more weaker, something which I think you can ask Mr. Amit Shah, who has a certain sense of that. Now, talking about nationalism,
yes,
I think the point about nationalism which you're talking about, you've already described it as muscular and robust, etc. Of course, there is an element of muscularity in India, which is different from a weak-kneed non-nationalism which at one time existed. Let's take a look at cricket, a game I imagine you like quite a lot.
We all like.
In the 1960s, if you can go back that far, and Shashi and I, we can at least, India was habituated to losing in cricket. If we won a game, it was a rarity.
Yes.
We remember the days when the sight of the West Indian pace bowlers used to make us quiver. Come from there to the time when another Bengali, Saurav Ganguly, took off his shirt on the pavilion at Lord's and on the balcony at Lord's, to the time where someone like Virat Kohli can outsledge the Australians. There is a fundamental change. We might not win every game, but there is a fundamental change in the way we play cricket today. And I think it's a mirror reflection of the way we feel as a country. It's a country we feel far more self-confident. We are no longer diffident about the fact that we have an Indian passport which we often present to someone else in a
and this is all post-2014.
No,
That's the question.
Did I say that? do not put words in my mouth. You know, your friend Karan Thapar is a great one for that. I am saying there is a process at work.
Okay.
And that process of the work has been very well captured by Narendra Modi far more effectively than anyone else in this country.
In fact, our mutual friend Arun
is that
Jaitley,
nationalism. And that assertive nationalism, which means that you shoot us, we won't turn the other cheek, we'll go and fight you in there.
Okay.
Our mutual friend Arun
precisely.
Jaitley told me
Remember what happened, let me just finish it,
Yes.
half a minute more. Remember what happened in 1990? When an entire community was driven out of the Kashmir Valley without anyone saying a week of protest. There was not even a murmur of protest from the so-called intellectuals, from the so-called nationalists, constitutionalists, which they said. Why? Because that was the mood at that time, that we take everything lying down. That was a weak India. That was a diffident India. This is a different India. Modi did not necessarily create it, but Modi certainly has helped encapsulate that trend.
Respond, Shashi Tharoor.
Well, obviously, he implies that Modi's like a surfer riding the wave, but the wave was there. I was just going to say that our mutual friend Arun Jaitley had said to me while I was still at the UN, so well before Modi's era, that India's role in the International Cricket Council was analogous to that of the US on the Security Council of the UN, which is something that gave me a lot of thought at that time, because I had not quite thought of it that way. That was many years before Modi. So there was clearly been a transformation in cricket. It's certainly been a transformation in many other attitudes in life. And it's part of a natural evolution. I think the evolution would not change who's in power, depending on who's in power. When Swapan says, remember 1990, I can turn around and say, remember 1999, when a BJP government cravenly surrendered a bunch of Pakistani terrorists to hijackers in Kandahar, resulting in untold loss of life later, because many of the people released have attacked our country subsequently and attacked Americans and others as well, killed Daniel Pearl, you name all of that stuff. So the fact is that there have been moments of weakness, pusillanimity, cravenness, whatever, from all party governments in the past. The times have changed. India is more self-confident. Partially, one would argue, because of 25 years of a Congress party-initiated liberalization, which has made us rich enough to feel more self-confident on the world stage. All of these things have to be taken into account. I'm not begrudging Mr. Modi the fact that he inherited all of this, but it was built up well before 2014.
He's captured the zeitgeist of India in a way that you haven't. What if I turned around and said that the Congress party has not recognized the zeitgeist of this young, aspirational India? Just look at the figures, for example. Mr. Modi has got 8% more vote among Indians aged 18 to 27 in 2019 compared to 2014. Has he captured that new India spirit, the spirit of the Virat Kohli generation, in a way better than the Congress party has? Do you concede that?
No, I'm not going to concede anything, Radip. I'm just saying that this is an observation which clearly we will have to reflect on and amend our position. I mean, I also know young people who said they voted for Mr. Modi in 2014 when they were naive collegians, and they wouldn't make that mistake again in 2019. Statistically, you may be right that he got a lot of young votes. And I am unstinting in my admiration for his rhetorical ability, if you want to capture the zeitgeist or to pitch his message to the audiences he speaks to. He's done that very well, very effectively in Hindi. And since that leaves much of my part of India untouched, I can say it with a certain amount of detachment and objectivity. Nonetheless, the larger issue of whether we want an inclusive India or an India that marginalizes some communities, makes some people feel unwanted, makes some people feel, in Swapan's word, ghettoized, that remains a fundamental issue to me. As far as national security is concerned, we're all united. I refuse to concede an inch to anybody else in terms of nationalism. The Congress party is and remains the original party of nationalism, on whether it's on our Indian stand on Kashmir, our Indian stand on POK, on robust foreign policy postures vis-a-vis these issues. There is no difference between the stands we've taken and the stand that Mr. Modi has taken. Mr. Modi's one difference is indeed that in conducting the Balakot strike, he for the first time, without a declared war, ventured into Pakistani airspace and fired a missile. That is a very powerful signal. What it portends and what it means still remains to be seen. It was a one-off incident. The truth is that there's a lot to be proven, and from our point of view, we have very, very much larger fish to fry than flexing our 56-inch chest and muscles at Pakistan. We've got an economy that is in free fall, which is why the finance minister made such a dramatic U-turn today from her budget speech just a few months ago, and why it is so important for us to ensure a peaceful neighborhood, because investors don't invest in war zones. So if you want to bring that money back that has been fleeing this country in the last 5 months, you need to create certainly a much more attractive atmosphere for investors and for businesses, but you also need to ensure, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that there is peace in the neighborhood and social peace within the country. Otherwise, no one's going to come and invest here.
May I just add
Yes.
to that? And I'm so glad, Shashi has said whatever he has, because I think it just demonstrates one very important point, that there is no schism over nationalism. That this nationalism is basically something which both of us agree with. Therefore, when people come and say, look, this is not my idea of India, this is not the India I grew up with.
There is a schism. I'll tell you the schism.
The schism is the one you try to inject into the picture to begin with by saying muscular, etc. And here was Shashi, who agreed with me entirely, and there was no real difference between that.
No, I won't let that pass.
You can not let it pass, but that's the reality.
If the BJP government, as it does, imposes sedition charges against against an Arundhati Roy, they will say it's part of their nationalism. One minute.
Has there been a sedition charge against her?
Sorry?
Has there been a sedition charge against her?
All right, there's a sedition charge against Sheila Rashid right now.
She very proudly says that she wants to secede from India, etc. But a writer's license is always conceded.
My point is, if there was a sedition charge against her, the BJP would treat it as a moment of, would defend it. The Congress presumably would oppose it. Your manifesto, for example, asked for a withdrawal of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Your manifesto asked for sedition to be removed from the statute books.
To be read down.
So there are differences in your visions of what is nationalism.
And we don't agree with the demonizing of every critic against the government as anti-national. Because we don't believe that you can conflate the Prime Minister with the party with the government with the nation. So if you criticize either the party or the Prime Minister, you're somehow anti-national. We don't accept that. Our idea of nationalism embraces dissent, embraces the right to differ, embraces acceptance. This entire principle is the antithesis of the BJP's idea of nationalism, which is exclusive, which is discriminatory, and which is...
so embraced dissent that the sedition charge was kept on the statute books till 2014.
But hardly ever applied.
Nevertheless, it was used also quite frequently. It was used in prevention of... there were various PD acts which were used at various points. These were issues
Swapan Dasgupta,
which were
Shashi
kept on
Tharoor,
the
I just have a minute. I want to ask you one final question each, which I want a short answer to. Is there a creeping authoritarianism, Swapan Dasgupta, in Modi's New India? Yes or no? Are we an elected autocracy, as is being suggested by some? You get elected through democracy, you execute through authoritarianism.
You lose an election and then say, why is Parliament a steamroller? You lose a case and then you say, the judiciary is bent. Someone accepts your narrative and then you say, well, they're only accepting one narrative. That is precisely the type of rigging, intellectual rigging which is taking place.
You passed Article 370.
And therefore,
Article 370 without even informing the opposition, without even giving a copy of the resolution to the opposition.
Sometimes it is necessary to have a surgical strike even there. You had the courage to do what hadn't been done for 70 years. You had the courage to do it. And I think it was necessary to do it.
So a surgical strike on Parliament was necessary?
No, it was surgical strike to do it.
Okay.
That was absolutely
necessary. You didn't reduce Parliament
Did
to
you
a
have the
notice
guts?
board?
Did you have the guts for you? No, you can't do that. When I'm saying you know exactly who I mean.
Okay. Shashi Tharoor, the question to you equally. Is there no place really for dynasticism anymore in this new India.
Oh, I thought you were going to give me a chance to answer the same question on authoritarianism.
No. He speaks of, the charge on him is that there is creeping authoritarianism. The charge on you is status quo as dynasticism. Look at what happened. Rahul Gandhi resigns. What next? Sonia Gandhi returns. How do you expect a new India to identify with a party which does not... Why is it that new talents cannot emerge? The fact is, Mr. Modi, all said and done, is the Dhoni story. I liken it to Dhoni, the man who's come in from Vadnagar, in Dhoni's case from Ranchi. When will that happen in your party, that someone comes on only on sheer merit and hard work, not because he's a fifth generation dynast?
Well,
why can't you be the president of the Congress?
Answer that.
No, Rajiv,
answer that, please.
Rajiv is merely doing what anchors do best to try and get me into trouble. But let me just say, Rajiv,
question.
But very seriously, Rajiv, the fact is that what you're asking has happened at every level of the party except the presidency. Don't even forget that the last two Congress prime ministers were not members of any dynasty or of the Gandhi family. And the fact is, therefore, that when you look at the way in which the party has encouraged talents to go in various places, I'm somebody who's had no political pedigree, nobody in my family has been in politics, and I have had to win elections on my own credentials. It hasn't been easy, but I've done it, and I've been given an opportunity to do it. So I don't think it's entirely fair to imply that only dynasticism works, because the fact is that if you were to look at even the 52 Lok Sabha MPs, a modest number, you will find an overwhelming majority are people who have come into politics through their own hard work and have risen up. Yes, at the leadership of the party, this is the preference of the party workers. I can tell you when Sonia ji agreed to take over the party again, there was an overwhelming sigh of relief on the part of the Karyakartas across the country. So this is the best possible solution because somebody else might have been a less acceptable figure. Now this is the reality of the party. It's also the reality of the Shiv Sena, of the Samajwadi, of the DMK, of very many parties in our country. It's not an unusual political culture in India to have a party that is identified from its very DNA with a particular family.
Except
but nonetheless, talent grows.
Doesn't happen in the BJP.
So an elected autocracy versus an elected dynasty. We'll ask the people of the country. The people of the country, in a sense, have chosen in 2019.
Yes.
We don't know what
they chose despite you, Rajdeep.
I am not a dynast. I am far from being a dynast. If I was a dynast, I'd have played cricket better than I did.
It's not cricket, Rajdeep. Okay. You know exactly.
No, what I mean is, and this is precisely the problem, when you ask questions in today's India, you immediately become part of them. So long as you ask questions that are convenient, you're part of us. I reject that us versus them. We've had both sides heard. Shashi Tharoor Swapan Dasgupta, we could carry on with this. I imagine this was what was happening in the Stephens dormitories in the 1970s, but we are now in 2019. Wonderful to have two articulate speakers. I just wish that some of those long words in English could be translated for the average Indian, but that will happen one day as well. That's the advantage of being, I guess, Stephanians with your own thesaurus.
I win my elections in Malayalam, Rajdeep.
Do you use the same long words in Malayalam that you use in English?
No, I use very short, because Malayalam has lots of long words, longer than in English. So I use the short ones.
Okay, wonderful to have
Setting an example.
Shashi Tharoor Swapan Dasgupta on Modi's New India. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.